Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Thomas Miller along with Robert Glasscock. You know, this is going to be an interesting discussion. I have no idea where this is going to go. We will see together. But one of the things that astrology can show, and Robert has truly perfected this in his years of readings. Now remember, he's been doing this for almost 60 years and has read for nearly 60,000 different chart readings. Obviously a pedigree that only time and experience can parallel. But within each of the configurations in a chart, you start to see patterns. And, you know, this gets into a lot of tangents, and Robert will pick this apart. Fate versus free will. Can this person change? Is this the way it's going to be? But broadly, we're going to talk about personality aspects that can show up in the chart where you would say, hey, be careful here. This soul that you're looking at the chart might have brought some stuff in that could be psychologically challenging. Robert has seen variations of this in his readings, and I thought it would be interesting to ask him about it. So, Robert, one of the areas that I'm thinking might be a springboard, at least to kind of substantiate this, of a starting place, are the dual signs. So Gemini, the two fish, Pisces would be another. You've mentioned Sagittarius. I'm curious, why is Sagittarius a divided sign?
Because it's half animal and half human.
Are there any other dual signs in the chart? Is Cancer, for example, a dual sign? No. Okay.
Cancer's the only dual signs are mutable.
Is that a place where we might, if somebody was looking in a chart and they wanted to at least raise an eyebrow of that there might be tendencies here of mental issues? We've talked about this before in other episodes, but I just wanted to drill down on this. Is that a good place to start with these divided signs?
It's a place to start, but I'll tell you, when you're asking about psychological health or dis-ease, in other words, tension, when you're talking about health, mental health or physical health, what house do you look at first? Quick.
Sixth.
As you know, I've got a book called The Sixth House of Psychological Self-Integration. The sixth house shows you, and I don't care what your sun sign is, what your moon sign is, the sixth house cusp will tell you a person's capacity for psychological self-integration or self-disintegration. So it shows both. And as we all know, the mind, body, spirit connection is all one. So your psychology, your psychological state absolutely affects your physiological health and vice versa. People get bad health diagnoses, they can become depressed, for example. So these things are not separate. They are all part of a single capacity to adapt, which is what the sixth house shows you. And the sixth house may have a mutable sign on it. Well, this tells you right off the bat, if it has Gemini, Pisces, or Sagittarius on the sixth cusp, right away, you have a dual psychological nature. Now, the house cusp alone is external conditioning. The planets are internal archetypes that are inside, born with. They're like DNA. So you could have a chart, let's say, with Gemini on the sixth house. Well, among other things, Gemini might rule, it does rule bipolarity or a borderline personality disorder, and on and on. So that's all you've got is Gemini on that sixth house. You can say this is a person who is dual in nature. It's like a push me, pull you. So they may be one of these people that go through life with these wonderful ideas, which they instantly undercut unconsciously by the way they behave or their refusal to get the education and training necessary to achieve these big ideas, and so on. So a mutable sign. Now, Virgo is the only mutable sign that is not a dual sign. And it also happens to rule the mind-body-spirit connection, Virgo does. So Virgo on the sixth cusp can actually be a person who is, for necessary reasons, interested in healthcare. That's a big, broad, it can be physical, mental, spiritual, but healthcare. They may go into a healthcare profession, become a nurse, a counselor, a doctor, a healer, a massage therapist, all these different kinds of healing techniques. But with the dual sign, Gemini, Sag, Pisces on the 6th, they're likely to have this kind of dual psychological nature, so that they begin to, these are the people that you will see, and they're very easy to spot. They'll say things and contradict them by their behavior. And that dichotomy between what people say and what they do may be a real problem in some cases. This is the origin of hypocrisy, for example. So people who say one thing and then behave in a completely contrary way, and behavior, actions are Mars always. So to assess all of this in any kind of deep way involves the whole horoscope, but a starting place is that 6th house. It's psychological self-integration in preparation for emerging into the public sphere above the horizon. So this is where a person finally, they get through grade school, they get through high school, and by then, all of their capacity to integrate themselves psychologically is already formed. And then they will emerge into the 7th cusp and on up through the 8th, 9th, and 10th, all the above the horizon. Those are the public spheres. So if their own conditioning, for example, with a mutable sign on the 6th cusp, they may come from a dysfunctional family, if you have afflictions to the ruler of the 6th, or a family that exhibits and conditions the person to behave in this way. If you have, say, parents who have strong convictions about anything, politics, religions, or the way to live, and yet those parental or community conditionings are not in agreement with the person themselves. What if you've got a person who has, let's say, Uranus in their 6th house? They're not going to be a traditional kid. Their hopes, their dreams, their ambitions, their desires, everything about them will have something of the rebel in it. It could be very positive. And they could be rebelling against a set of parents whose life views are very restrictive. Or it could be very negative. They may sacrifice their own individuality and independence and creativity and all of that, those Uranian qualities, to conforming to what their conditioning, their parents, their town, their church, and so on, tell them to do. But that goes against the grain of Uranus, which is what they're born with. So that even if they try to conform, that won't work either. The only solution to something like that is for the person to follow their bliss, their independence, their Uranian qualities, wherever it leads. And sadly, that will often indicate getting away from the dysfunction in which they were born. I don't know if this is clear enough or not, but this is the beginning of how to look at a chart from this kind of psychological aspect.
No, that helps a lot. In fact, that, we're looking for starting places. We're looking for that as you want to scratch your chin or raise an eyebrow, that you have a few places here that you might want to look at. Let's bring the planets into this. So are we talking about the malefics? Is that where we would, again, we're just raising our eyebrow. Would we look at Mars and Saturn and Pluto, maybe, possibly Neptune, as, again, starting places of where we might have conflict, especially if those planets were in aspect to something like our sun or moon?
Absolutely. And let's just say arbitrarily, you can start anywhere, but I like to start with, in fact, the 6th house is the first house I look at in anybody's horoscope. So here, for example, we were talking about Gemini or Sagittarius or anything on a mutable sign on the 6th. And if, let's say, the 6th house is empty, well, that person's psychological self-integration will be ruled by the planet that rules the sign on the 6th. whether it be Jupiter ruling Sag. Jupiter also rules Pisces. Remember, it's the old Chaldean rulership, and you can also bring Neptune in with Pisces. But then, so starting with the sixth house, you look at the planetary ruler and its configuration in the chart. Is it under stress aspects, that planetary ruler? Is it in a mutable sign, which further emphasizes the bipolarity or the mutability of the sign in any case? And by the way, the mutable signs are wonderful as far as adaptability goes. These are the signs that can absolutely work around, work over, work under. They can adapt to whatever life throws at them, but they are often under this kind of internal stress between, if they have these conflicting aspects, between the two parts of themselves. Usually it does go back to the childhood. And sometimes there will be divorce, for example, in the family, with one parent representing one sort of archetypal background, while the other parent represents another one. Obviously, they have to be differences or they wouldn't have gotten divorced. So that person will have been raised in an atmosphere of maybe unconscious conflict between the parents. And so that will be their image of what a marriage is. Growing up, they will expect relationships to be that way because that's what they were shown and conditioned to be. Well, what if their son is in, say, Taurus? That life force, the sun in Taurus, is not about mental instability or mental problems at all. It's a fixed sign and so on. So if they are born into a family that has a lot of psychological dysfunction, that a Taurus person, we're just using for example, will learn to rely on themselves over anything else that they're told. And they, by nature, Taurus wants to get along and live peacefully. So it will adapt to its parents until it can get away, if they do, and get out on their own to then live their own lives, even though their life choices might be in conflict with their parents. So it ultimately encompasses every planet in the chart. But if you start, then, second of all, you're going to want to look at the sun sign. You're going to want to look at Mercury, which is the mind. You're going to definitely look at the moon. And the more mutability and conflicts like squares, conjunctions, as you mentioned, oppositions, and inconjunction, those are the stress aspects. So the more of that, the more mutability and the more stress you see, the more likelihood there will be of psychological issues. That's all.
You know, I've seen you do this several different times and ways. I've seen it in the practicums. I've heard it in personal discussions that we've had. How did you learn how to put all of this together? Was this something that came from the books or from Linda or from your own experience or all of the above?
I want to say it took about 7.5 minutes, but that's not true.
7.5 decades, but you're not that old yet.
Well, and the thing about it is you never stop learning, which is the only reason I am still doing this. I can't believe when you said almost 60 years, it's true. I just don't think of it that way until somebody calls it to my attention, but that's it. It's just when I started out, we didn't have computers. We didn't have online. You had to read books. You had to read books. And at one point I had something like 900 and something books, which finally I'd been moving, and got tired of carrying them around. But I learned from books and then practice. Linda and I were friends. I would never call myself a colleague of hers for about 4 years. And I really only saw her when she was in Los Angeles, which she was fairly frequently. She was working on her second book at that point. And then she invited me up to Cripple Creek. I spent one winter up there. I actually house sat for her while she went back to New York for Christmas. So I never studied with her in a formal sense. But I knew her when I knew her at these kinds of erratic moments when she would show up in Los Angeles or in Cripple Creek, and I watched how she worked. I was very fortunate at one point to watch her read for 6 oil magnates in Vail, Colorado. I was the one who calculated the horoscopes for her, and I drove us up to Vail in snow and watched her. I would hand each chart to her as she read for these gentlemen, and I just watched what she did. But that's about it. I didn't have any extensive training from her, and I guess I didn't need it, but boy, was it valuable for me to see how another astrologer, especially one at her level, how she worked.
And then the other question that comes to mind on this topic is fated, or do we have choice? So when you look at this, and in fact, if somebody was looking at this at their own chart or their child's chart, you're talking about Neptune and being in Pisces here, that's a whole generational thing. Is this something that is going to play out, or how much latitude of choice do we have to work through? Or are you going to take some synchronistic hits to be able to deal with these things? What do you see over 60,000 readings in that area?
Well, this whole fate and free will question, of course, is at the heart of everything. My experience is that we choose our own births. That's metaphysics. Nobody forces you to be incarnated. Not God, not nobody. You incarnate physically because you desire to do it. Now, it's very difficult for some people to say, why would I desire to be born without arms, to be born as a thalidomide baby? And yet there are very valid reasons for a soul choosing to be born in such a state. That's fate. If you're born without arms, you cannot regenerate arms in this physical existence. But look at the choice you have. Always you have a choice. This life was a choice. Every bit of it from birth is a choice. It's not forced on you. You don't come back because you did something horrible in a previous life unless you want to. If you feel, and I've, believe me, been there. I had experience once with Brian Jameson, a wonderful past life regressionist, about a lifetime that I had at Versailles, of all. But we were one of hundreds of families who lived there at the behest of the king. And in this regression, when I was on my deathbed, I began to cry in this regression. And Brian said to me, why are you crying? And I said, because I have wasted this entire life. I'm on my deathbed. And Brian says, what are you dying of? And I said, syphilis, cirrhosis of the liver, diabetes. I've done nothing but eat, drink, and debauch myself because I never had to work. We lived at the palace. I think my dad may have been a doctor in that life. But anyway, we were one of hundreds of families who lived there. We weren't particularly rich, but I didn't have to work. And that's what I had done with that life, nothing. And the feeling of having wasted a life in that way was just so overwhelming and so sad to me. But it ties into this life. Why would I choose to come into an alcoholic family? To see if I could overcome it. That's why. And I did. I'm like nothing like those people. And I left them at 20 to go to Los Angeles. I didn't have this in the back of my mind. I didn't realize this is what I was doing, but it was exactly what I was doing. Is proving to myself in this life that I wouldn't sacrifice my life to a bunch of drunks, to put it profanely. And astrology is absolutely what saved my life. So that's one of the reasons I was born. So that's fate. It's fate if you're born to an alcoholic or dysfunctional family, but it's your choice to be born there. And what are you learning from it? Are you going to stay with that? Are you going to outgrow it? Are you going to understand it? That's where free will comes in. If you're born without arms, you can go through life bemoaning your fate, or you can begin to, like many people do, wait a minute, aren't there artificial limbs? Why, yes, there are. How do I get one? Why, here's one that costs $45,000, but look what it can do. You see what I mean? So it's the response, the reaction to your, quote, fate. I think the real purpose of astrology is to understand your fate, which is what this chart, your predispositions, that's what the horoscopes show. And in the areas where you are getting negative results in life, relationships always break up, they always end badly, you can't hold a job, you don't have any money in the bank. All of those things that you're dissatisfied with are reflections of your own choices. They're not fate. They're your choices. I can't leave my family. I don't have any money. Well, tell that to all the entrepreneurs who were born into nothing back in the 1900s and went on to become billionaire magnates. Of course you have choice. It may be hard. You may have to leave your family and where you were born in order to fulfill yourself, but nonetheless, will you do it or will you not? So to me, astrology is the opposite of fate. If you understand this stuff, you are fate-free. Or more precisely, you understand that you create your own fate. You get with somebody like Swami Paramahansa Yogananda, the autobiography of a yogi. He writes in there, pick the worst day astrologically for me to start a business, and I will start a business on that day, and it will succeed. And it will. Because when you understand that hard aspects, for example, they're not excuses for failure. They are meant to create conflicts that are frustrating to you, to motivate you to heal them or solve them. So hard aspects are an invitation to deeper understanding so that your behavior changes, your reactions to life change through astrology. So to me, astrology, if it's properly understood, is the opposite of what most people refer to as fate. Astrology frees you from that.
Well, this is an area that we could spend hours on, and maybe what we should do is accumulate some questions. If you guys have questions that you'd like to ask around this, we'd be happy to see if we could tackle them. We have to be obviously judicious here, but if it is something that we could talk about, we would. Robert, thanks. This is great and a very important topic, and astrology gives us a little bit of a clue that can give us some insight into perhaps what we're dealing with when we encounter various people. All of the resources of the podcast are in our show notes. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll see you next time on Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast.